"I want a child, but not with you," said the millionaire CEO. 2 years later, he saw her again and couldn't leave. Harrison didn't raise his voice when he said it. He didn't need to. The words cut through the room with the calm of someone stating a business decision, not ending a life they had built together. Renata stood at the marble counter, her mug still warm between her palms, watching steam rise as though it might carry meaning upward. For a moment she waited for the rest of the sentence, the softer ending, the explanation that would make sense of what she had just heard. It never came. Outside the wall of glass, the city pulsed with its usual confidence, headlights streaming along the river, helicopters tracing quiet paths through the dark sky. Inside, the silence grew so heavy it bent her posture. 3 years reduced to 8 words, not shouted, not argued, delivered cleanly the way he closed deals. And with that, the future she had held so gently was gone. She didn't cry at first. Tears would have made the moment too honest, and nothing about that apartment had ever allowed honesty to stay long. Renata crossed the living room in slow steps, each heel sinking into the carpet like it was asking her to reconsider. The suitcase lay open on the bed, where she had once folded his shirts, careful with the cuffs, careful with everything that belonged to him. Her hands shook as she lifted a framed photo from the nightstand. It was from their first vacation together, the one where he'd taken a call during dinner and apologized afterward without meeting her eyes. She set the frame face down, afraid the smile inside it might still try to convince her to stay. By the time she reached the door, the rain had begun. It streaked across the glass in uneven lines, blurring the skyline into something distant and unreachable, just like him. Have you ever been standing in the middle of your life when the person you trusted most suddenly rewrote the rules without asking you? Have you ever felt the ground shift under your feet while everyone else kept moving, unaware that your world had just changed forever? Maybe it wasn't in a luxury apartment. Maybe it was a kitchen, a driveway, a late-night phone call that ended with a pause that said more than any argument ever could. The details don't matter. The feeling does. That hollow moment when you realize love is no longer a shared direction but 2 separate paths pretending they still meet. Renata didn't scream as she stepped into the rain. She didn't look back. She only wondered how something that had felt so permanent could vanish without warning, leaving her to carry both the memory of what was said and the weight of everything that would never be said again. This is what happens when one heart treats love like a weakness and the other believes it is the reason to wake up each morning. Renata had never asked Harrison to abandon his dreams. She only wanted space inside them, a seat at the table where futures were planned, not postponed. But to him, affection was a liability. A family was a schedule risk. Commitment was something to manage, not cherish. He measured life in quarters and outcomes, never noticing the cost of every decision he made to protect his momentum. So when he said he wanted a child, just not with her, it wasn't cruelty in his mind. It was efficiency. It was a clean solution to a problem he believed love had created. What he failed to see was that some problems don't disappear when you dismiss them. They wait, quietly, until the day you are forced to face them. Renata didn't know then that leaving that building was not the end of her story with Harrison. She believed the door closing behind her was final, that time would do its quiet work and erase the ache he left behind. She believed, like most people do, that life moves forward in straight lines. But some endings circle back, because somewhere in the years ahead, a child would enter the world without ever hearing his name. A small hand would learn to hold a crayon, to laugh at shadows on the wall, to trust without reservation. And one evening, in a room filled with strangers and polite applause, Harrison would see a face he thought he had buried in memory, standing beside a little girl who carried the echo of a life he had rejected. The man who once walked away would discover that there are things you can't walk past twice. Before this story carries you any deeper, I want to invite you into it, not as a listener, but as someone whose own life might recognize these moments. If a single sentence ever changed the direction of your heart, let me know in the comments. Your experience matters here, and someone reading it may realize they are not alone. If this opening already pulled at something inside you, tap the like button so this story can find the people who need it most. And if you want more stories that don't just pass time but remind you what truly matters, subscribe to Mr. Williams Storytime. Now let's begin the journey you didn't expect, but may never forget. Morning in Harrison Langford's home never began with light. It began with sound. The soft alert from a device synced to global markets, the hum of automated blinds sliding upward, the faint hiss of espresso machines programmed to deliver precision rather than pleasure. Renata lay awake before any of it started, listening to the order arrive before emotion had a chance to exist. Harrison didn't stretch when he woke. He checked numbers. He walked past the wide windows without glancing at the river below, already scrolling through overnight reports, already negotiating with people who had never met her. His wardrobe was a gallery of tailored certainty, dark suit, flawless cuff, watch calibrated to cities she had never seen. Renata watched him from the bed, silk sheets cool against her legs. She wondered when mornings stopped feeling like beginnings and started feeling like rehearsals. He kissed her cheek out of habit, not attention. It landed lightly, like punctuation at the end of a sentence he had already written in his head. This was their life, flawless, efficient, admired, and completely untouched by warmth. The bedroom was always immaculate, as though disorder had been banned from the premises. The bed was wide enough for two people who rarely met in the middle anymore. Renata would wake some nights reaching for him, only to find empty space already cooling beside her. He'd slipped out to answer calls from offices that never slept, leaving behind nothing but the faint trace of his cologne and the quiet reminder that work had once again claimed him first. When he did return, long after midnight, he didn't wake her. He undressed in careful silence, easing himself beneath the covers like a guest afraid of overstaying his welcome. They lay inches apart, sharing the same warmth without sharing a single thought. Their breathing never matched. Renata missed the version of him who used to talk about nothing while brushing his teeth, who once held her from behind while she made coffee just to feel her there. Now the only thing that followed him into bed was the glow of his phone lighting his face with numbers and urgent messages. They were together every night. And somehow, always alone. She chose her moment carefully, the way people do when they already know the answer might hurt. Dinner had gone untouched between them, plates growing cold while he finished one last email. Renata rested her hands around her glass, steadying herself as though the words might spill if she didn't hold them down. "Harrison," she said, her voice softer than she intended, "do you ever think about what comes after all this?" He looked up, distracted, eyes still somewhere between the screen and the future he was planning. "I mean us," she continued, pressing on before she lost her nerve. "Not the company, not the schedule. I think about mornings with noise in the house, about teaching someone how to ride a bike. I think about being a mother." For a second, hope flickered. It was small, fragile, but it was there. She leaned forward, waiting for him to meet her halfway. Instead, he paused, not the pause of consideration, but the pause of calculation. The kind that happens when someone is deciding how much truth they can afford to release without damaging their image. She had opened her heart. He was preparing a response. Harrison set his phone face down, a rare gesture that should have meant she had his full attention. Yet Renata could see it, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the way his gaze drifted past her shoulder toward the glowing skyline beyond the windows. His mind was racing ahead, mapping outcomes, weighing consequences, deciding how much of himself he was willing to risk. He did want a child. He had imagined it in abstract terms, a name on a future calendar, a line item in a life plan. What he could not picture was the disorder that would follow, missed meetings, a fractured routine, priorities he could not schedule or control. He had built his world so carefully that even affection had to pass through filters before it was allowed in. Renata watched the silence settle between them and felt the fragile hope inside her begin to weaken. She had not asked for perfection. She had asked for partnership. Inside Harrison, something tugged, a memory of simpler days, of shared laughter, of dreams that once included her without conditions. But that memory had no place in the empire he was guarding. Love had become a variable he no longer trusted. When he finally lifted his eyes to meet hers, the answer was already forming, not in his heart, but in his logic. "I do want a child," Harrison said at last, his tone measured, as though he were choosing words for a board presentation instead of a life-changing moment. Renata leaned in slightly, a breath of relief already forming in her chest. But not with you. The sentence landed gently, too gently. It didn't crash. It didn't echo. It simply existed, final and complete, like a door closing without a sound. Renata stared at him, searching for the hidden meaning that had to be there. A joke, a test, anything that would return the world to its former shape. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Her hands tightened around the edge of the table, knuckles whitening as though the furniture itself might anchor her to something real. "Why?" she managed. His answer was swift, too swift to be kind. "Because love complicates things," he replied. "I can't afford to lose focus." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't soften it either. He simply stated the truth as he saw it, unaware that he had just reduced 3 years of shared life to a strategic liability. There were no slammed doors, no accusations thrown like weapons, only quiet, thick, absolute, and impossible to escape. Renata waited for anger to arrive, for tears to rescue her from the numbness spreading through her chest. Nothing came. Harrison returned to his phone, not because he was cruel, but because he didn't know what else to do once the decision had been delivered. In his world, the hard part was over. She looked at the man she loved and realized he had already left the room, even though his body remained in the chair across from her. The distance between them was no longer measured in feet but in futures. Hers had just been erased. His was continuing on schedule. The clock on the wall kept moving second after second, as though mocking her for standing still. Outside, traffic surged along the river, people heading home to families she had just lost in theory. When Renata finally rose from her seat, the scrape of the chair across the floor was the loudest sound in the apartment. It startled even her. The silence had become a presence of its own. She didn't pack with urgency. Urgency would have meant chaos, and chaos would have admitted that she was falling apart. Instead, Renata moved through the apartment with deliberate care, lifting each object as though it might still change its mind and belong to her again. She folded sweaters he had never noticed, placed books back into the boxes they came from, tucked away the coffee mug with the chipped rim that had once made him smile. Every item carried a fragment of a version of them that no longer existed. In the bathroom mirror, she caught a reflection and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her eyes were steady, but there was a thin crack running through the calm, the kind you don't see until it finally gives way. She tied her hair back, wiped her face clean, and kept moving. Harrison didn't follow her. He didn't ask if she needed help. The apartment was quiet enough that she could hear the faint tapping of his keyboard from the other room, a reminder that while she was packing up a life, he was already continuing his. She closed the suitcase and pressed down until the latch snapped. That sound felt permanent. Renata didn't announce her departure. She simply walked to the door, suitcase rolling behind her across floors that had once felt like proof she had arrived somewhere meaningful. Harrison looked up only when the handle turned, as if the noise itself had permission to interrupt his plans. "Renata," he said, her name suddenly unsure in his mouth. She stopped but did not face him. If she did, she knew she might stay. The elevator was waiting, doors held open by a sensor that didn't care about broken hearts. As she stepped inside, the hallway light framed her in gold for a final moment, then vanished behind closing metal. The descent was silent. Floor numbers blinked past with mechanical calm, counting down not just levels but the years she had spent trying to be enough for someone who had already chosen a different future. When the doors opened at the lobby, she rolled her suitcase into the night. Rain met her face like a second farewell. Above her, the penthouse glowed, perfect, distant, and already forgetting her. 2 years passed, and Harrison Langford became the man every magazine wanted on its cover. His company expanded across borders, his name attached to innovation panels, charity galas, leadership summits that treated him like a blueprint for success. He learned how to smile on cue, how to deliver gratitude without giving away anything personal. Yet each night the penthouse greeted him with stillness. The furniture was flawless. The walls held art chosen by consultants who had never asked what made him feel at home. He poured drinks he rarely finished and stared at a skyline that now felt more like an obligation than a reward. The awards lined one shelf in the living room, heavy, polished, engraved with praise. He never dusted them himself. Someone else always took care of that. Sometimes he paused beside them, fingertips brushing the edges, waiting for something to happen inside him. It never did. The world saw men who had everything. Harrison saw a schedule that never ended, and rooms that had learned how to echo. Renata didn't choose her new town from a list. She simply drove until the buildings thinned and the air began to smell like salt instead of ambition. The highway stretched ahead of her like permission to disappear, mile after mile pulling her farther, from glass towers and calendar alerts. By the time she reached the coast, the sun was setting, staining the water in soft shades she had forgotten existed. She rented a small room above a bakery where the morning started with warmth instead of deadlines. No one knew her name. No one asked about her past. For the first time in years, she was allowed to exist without being measured. She walked the beach at dawn, shoes in hand, letting the cold water rush over her ankles. Some days she cried without knowing why. Other days she felt light enough to laugh at nothing at all. Both felt like progress. The world she had lost no longer followed her here. And in that quiet, anonymous place, something inside her began to breathe again. The test sat on the bathroom counter longer than it needed to. Renata paced the length of the small room, counting cracks in the tile, pretending she could slow the moment by refusing to face it. When she finally turned back, the answer was already waiting, simple and undeniable. Her knees gave way first. She slid to the floor, one hand braced against the cabinet, the other hovering over the plastic stick that had just rewritten her future. Fear arrived immediately, sharp, insistent, full of questions she didn't yet have the strength to ask. She was alone in a town where no one knew her. Her savings were modest. There was no one to lean on, and yet beneath the worry, something else took root. Wonder. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach, hardly daring to believe that anything was there yet. A quiet laugh escaped her, half sob, half disbelief. The life she had asked for and been denied had chosen her anyway, arriving without permission and without condition. That night, Renata fell asleep with her hands still resting on her belly, already guarding something she hadn't even met. She said the name aloud before she wrote it down. Lyra. The room was quiet enough to carry the sound from one wall to the other. Renata sat cross-legged on the bare wooden floor of her apartment, a notebook open in her lap, the pages filled with half-finished lists that no longer mattered. She had tried dozens of names, whispering them into the stillness, waiting to feel something real. Nothing had felt right until now. Lyra was the name she used to hum under her breath when she imagined bedtime stories and tiny shoes by the door. It felt gentle without being fragile, strong without needing to announce itself. She traced the letters carefully, as though the ink might disappear if she didn't hold the pen just so. For the first time since leaving Harrison, Renata smiled without forcing it. This wasn't a plan she had shared with anyone. There would be no announcements, no grand reveal. Just a promise between a mother and the child growing quietly inside her. She closed the notebook and pressed it to her chest, already practicing how it would feel to say it for years to come. Lyra arrived on a night when the town was wrapped in mist and streetlights glowed like tired stars. Renata brought her home to an apartment that suddenly felt too small and somehow not enough, even as it became everything she had. The nights were the hardest. At 3 a.m, when the world was asleep and the bakery downstairs hadn't yet begun its day, Lyra's cries filled the space like a question Renata was still learning how to answer. She paced the narrow living room with the baby tucked against her shoulder, whispering nonsense just to remind herself that her voice was still steady. Some evenings she cried too, resting her forehead against the wall while rocking back and forth, wondering how love could weigh so much. There were no schedules here, no certainty, only instinct and exhaustion braided together. But then Lyra would quiet, her small fingers curling into the fabric of Renata's shirt, and something inside her would settle. In the dark, with nothing but the soft rhythm of breathing between them, Renata began to understand what it meant to belong to someone completely. Time didn't rush her forward. It arrived in tiny moments that felt too ordinary to celebrate until Renata realized they were everything. Lyra's first laugh came while Renata was making oatmeal, the pot boiling over as she turned just in time to see her daughter's face light up with sound. It wasn't loud. It wasn't polished. It was pure. A burst of joy that caught Renata so off guard she dropped the spoon and laughed with her, tears running freely down her cheeks. The first steps followed months later in the cramped living room. Lyra wobbled away from the couch, arms lifted like she was reaching for the air itself. Renata crouched a few feet away, hands open, heart hammering as if she were the one learning how to stand. When Lyra fell, she clapped anyway. When she stood again, Renata cried. These weren't milestones written in baby books. They were proof that something beautiful was happening far from boardrooms and headlines, something growing quietly, one small victory at a time. Renata didn't notice the healing when it began. There was no morning where she woke up free of the past. It arrived in pieces, the way Lyra rested her head against her shoulder during walks, the way the neighbors started greeting them by name, the way laughter slowly filled rooms that had once held nothing but quiet. The ache of what Harrison had said still lived somewhere inside her, but it no longer directed her days. Motherhood demanded presence, not memory. There were lunches to pack, tiny socks to hunt for, bedtime stories to invent when Lyra insisted the book end differently. Each task stitched something back together. One afternoon, Renata caught her reflection in a cafe window while balancing Lyra on her hip. The woman looking back wasn't broken. She was tired, yes, but there was steadiness in her eyes, a calm she hadn't owned before. She had not rebuilt the life she lost. She had built a new one. Before we move forward, take a moment to reflect on Renata's journey so far. She didn't find strength in applause or approval. She found it in ordinary mornings, in tiny hands holding onto her shirt and learning how to keep going when there was no one left to impress. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever lost something you thought defined your future, only to discover that the ending made room for a different beginning? Maybe it was a relationship, a job, or a dream that quietly slipped away. Share your story in the comments. You never know who might find courage in your words. If Renata's path has touched you even a little, please tap the like button so more people can discover the story. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Mr. Williams Storytime. We're here to tell the kinds of stories that don't just pass the time. They remind us that sometimes the moment everything falls apart is the moment life truly starts. The ballroom shimmered with money. Crystal chandeliers hovered like frozen fireworks above tables dressed in white linen and confidence. Waiters moved with rehearsed grace, carrying glasses that caught the light just enough to remind everyone that they had arrived somewhere important. Harrison Langford stood near the stage, jacket buttoned, posture perfected. This was his natural environment now. Donors asking for selfies, board members praising quarterly numbers, strangers shaking his hand as though proximity alone might rub success onto their own lives. He smiled when required. He nodded when expected. His name was announced twice during the evening, each time followed by applause that rose and fell like a trained response. The crowd loved him. The company logo behind the podium glowed with promise, yet even in the middle of admiration, his attention drifted, not to the screen, not to the speaker, but toward the entrance where new guests filtered in, carrying coats, laughter, and lies that didn't belong to his schedule. Something tugged at him, not memory, not instinct, but the faint sense that the room was about to remind him of something he had buried and never truly left behind. He spotted her between shoulders in dark suits, just a glimpse at first, the familiar tilt of her head, the way she brushed hair behind her ear as she leaned down to speak to someone shorter than herself. Harrison's hand tightened around his glass before he realized he had stopped moving. Renata, not in memory, not softened by time, standing in the middle of a room that had never deserved her. The noise around him continued as if nothing had changed. Laughter burst from a nearby table. A violinist tuned strings at the edge of the stage, yet Harrison heard none of it. His pulse found his ears, each beat louder than the last, reminding him that the part of his life he had sealed away had just stepped back into the open. He told himself to look elsewhere, to pretend he hadn't seen her, but his eyes wouldn't obey. She was wearing a simple blue dress, nothing like the gowns she used to wear beside him. There was no tension in her shoulders, no waiting. Whatever she had become in the years apart, it wasn't someone searching for his approval, and that was what unsettled him most. Harrison was already struggling to steady himself when the small figure beside Renata shifted, tugging lightly at her hand. At first he thought it was a niece or a child belonging to someone else at the table, but when the girl tilted her face upward, curiosity written plainly across it, his chest tightened without warning. Lyra. He didn't know her name yet, but something in her eyes struck him with a strange familiarity. The curve of her smile, the way her brows lifted as she took in the glittering room with cautious interest. She wasn't fidgeting, she wasn't overwhelmed. She was observing, just like Renata used to when they first entered unfamiliar places together. The realization arrived without permission. This child did not belong to the room. She belonged to Renata. Harrison felt the ground inside him give way. The timeline he had locked away began to rearrange itself, piece by piece, until a truth he hadn't prepared for stood fully formed in his mind. The woman he had walked away from had not paused her life while he chased his. She had built something new. The room hadn't altered its appearance. The lights still glowed. The music still floated gently between tables. But to Harrison, everything felt off balance, as though the floor beneath him had shifted a fraction too far. Renata laughed at something Lyra whispered to her, bending slightly to listen, her posture open and unguarded in a way he hadn't seen in years. He watched them share a quiet moment that required no audience and no approval, and it left him strangely exposed. This was a version of her untouched by the world he had chosen. Guests passed between them, unaware they were crossing an invisible boundary. Harrison tried to form a plan, walk away, wait for a better moment, let time settle the rush in his chest. None of it worked. His eyes returned to the child again and again, searching for meaning in small gestures that shouldn't have mattered. Every achievement he had collected over the past 2 years suddenly felt fragile, as though it could be knocked aside by the simple act of a little girl tugging at her mother's hand. The gala continued. Harrison did not. He didn't remember deciding to move. One moment he was rooted near the stage, the next he was standing a few feet from Renata, the noise of the room blurring at the edges like it had lost its place. "Renata," he said. She turned, surprise crossing her face before settling into composure. For a heartbeat neither of them spoke. Then Lyra shifted closer to her mother's side, small fingers tightening their hold. "Harrison," Renata replied, the name spoken without warmth or bitterness, just recognition. Lyra studied him with open curiosity. "Mommy, who's that?" Renata didn't hesitate. She knelt to meet her daughter's eyes, brushing a loose curl from Lyra's forehead. "An old friend," she said. The word landed gently, yet it struck harder than any accusation could have. Not former partner, not someone important, just a fragment from a past that no longer shaped her present. Harrison nodded, pretending the title didn't carve something out of him. He looked at the child again, searching for an explanation that Renata had already closed the door on. "How old is she?" he asked quietly. 3, Renata replied. "Her name is Lyra, 3. The number settled over Harrison like a weight he hadn't trained for. His mind raced backward through calendars, deals, milestones that suddenly felt misplaced. 3 years ago was when Renata had walked out of his life with a suitcase and nothing else. 3 years ago was when he had told her that love was a distraction. He managed a polite smile for Lyra, lowering himself slightly so he wasn't towering over her. "Hello," he said, unsure what tone belonged here. She smiled back, shy but unafraid. Renata straightened, her expression unreadable. "We should get back to our table," she said, already guiding Lyra away. Harrison watched them go, the crowd parting effortlessly for a woman and a child who did not belong to this world of sponsors and speeches. The applause from the stage rose again, celebrating something he had helped create, yet it reached him as background noise. In that moment, surrounded by recognition and comfort, Harrison understood something he had avoided for years. Everything he had built was intact, and somehow, he had never felt more incomplete. The bookstore was the kind of place Harrison never visited anymore. Narrow aisles, uneven shelves, the faint scent of paper that had been handled by too many curious hands to ever feel new. He had ducked inside only because the afternoon meeting ended early and the rain had begun without warning. He was halfway through scanning a table of recent releases when he heard her voice, not calling his name, laughing. He followed the sound before he questioned himself, rounding a corner to find Renata crouched near the children's section, her coat draped over her arm, her attention fully given to a little girl kneeling at a low table cluttered with crayons. Lyra was coloring with fierce focus, tongue caught between her teeth as she worked across the page. Renata watched her the way people do when they don't feel observed, relaxed, unguarded, real. For a moment Harrison stayed where he was, unseen, aware that he was standing at the edge of a life that had learned how to exist without him. This wasn't a gala. There were no sponsors or speeches to hide behind, just a woman, a child, and a quiet world he had never chosen, until now, when it had chosen him back. Lyra didn't notice him at first. She was too busy filling the page with loops of purple and green, her small foot tapping against the leg of the table in a rhythm only she understood. A soft tune slipped from her lips, barely louder than breath, a melody without words that rose and fell as her crayon moved. Renata leaned closer. "What are you drawing?" she asked. Lyra didn't look up. "A house," she replied, as if that explained everything. Harrison watched from a distance, struck by how completely the child belonged in this ordinary moment. There were no expectations placed on her, no image to maintain. She was allowed to take up space simply by existing. When Lyra finally glanced up and spotted him, her expression shifted to recognition. Not fear, curiosity. "Hi," she said, as though they were meeting in a park instead of a quiet store where the past had just caught up to him. Renata straightened slowly, her body angling in front of her daughter in a way that was almost instinctive. She didn't step back. She didn't step away either. She waited. He approached them with care, unsure of the boundaries he had already crossed simply by being there. Lyra had returned to her picture, content with the brief greeting, while Renata brushed a speck of crayon dust from the table, her movements small and practiced. "You come here often?" he asked, immediately aware of how empty the question sounded. Renata gave a brief nod. "It keeps her busy when it rains." Lyra hummed again, absorbed, the outside world shrinking to a sheet of paper and a handful of colors. When she dropped a crayon, Renata retrieved it before it rolled too far, setting it back beside her daughter without interrupting her focus. Harrison noticed the details, the way Renata crouched instead of towering, the way her tone never rushed. This was not the woman who once waited on him to finish calls before speaking. This version of Renata had learned to bend her world around someone else, and she did it without resentment. For the first time, Harrison felt like he was observing a reality he had never been invited into before, not because he wasn't allowed, but because he had never made room for it. "So," Harrison said after a pause that stretched too long to ignore, "how have you been?" Renata lifted her gaze to meet his, her expression calm but carefully contained. "We're well," she replied, choosing her words with precision. "Not I, we." It was a boundary as clear as any locked door. Lyra slid her finished page toward her mother. Renata smiled at it, a private, tender smile that never reached Harrison. "That's beautiful," she told her, folding the paper so it wouldn't crease. Harrison waited for more, a question, an opening, anything that might invite him closer to the world unfolding at their feet. None came. "This is Lyra's favorite place," Renata continued, her voice level. "It's quiet. She can focus." There was nothing unkind in her tone, yet every sentence carried a reminder. Her life was full, structured, protected. She wasn't standing here to reconnect. She was standing here because she happened to be, and because she trusted herself enough to stay. Harrison nodded, aware that he was a guest in a story that no longer centered him. Sleep refused to come. Harrison lay in the dark of his penthouse, the city glowing faintly beyond the curtains, replaying the afternoon in fragments that refused to stay quiet. The way Lyra's foot tapped against the table, the softness in Renata's voice when she spoke to her daughter, the calm authority she carried now, not borrowed from anyone, not waiting for approval. He had faced setbacks before, lost contracts, public criticism, markets that shifted without warning. None of it followed him into the night the way this did. This wasn't something he could solve with strategy or silence. He reached for his phone, stopped himself, then reached again. Renata's name still lived in his contacts, untouched for years, as if some part of him had known this moment would arrive. He didn't call. He only stared at the screen until it dimmed. For the first time in a long while, Harrison questioned the path he had guarded so fiercely. Not in theory, not in conversation, but here, alone, with nothing to distract him from the life he had chosen and the one he had let go. Harrison didn't plan to return the next day. He told himself the bookstore had been coincidence, a moment that didn't require a sequel. Yet by mid-afternoon he found himself standing outside a modest building 2 streets from Renata's apartment, a hand-painted sign above the door announcing art sessions for local children. Inside, the room buzzed with small voices and scraping chairs. Renata stood near a long table, guiding a group of kids through a simple project, sleeves rolled up, hair pulled back without ceremony. She looked nothing like the woman who once waited for his calendar to clear before speaking. This Renata didn't glance at the door when he entered. She was present. Lyra sat near the end of the table, coloring again, a familiar rhythm of concentration shaping her movements. When Renata noticed him, she hesitated only long enough to decide not to send him away. She gave a polite nod and returned to the children. Harrison took a seat against the far wall, uncertain of his place, watching a world unfold that had never existed on his schedule, and wondering for the first time how he had missed something this real. Harrison tried to make himself small, but Lyra noticed him anyway. She studied him for a moment, head tilted, then picked up her page and padded across the room with a confidence that seemed far too large for her size. "This is for you," she said, holding it out with both hands. The drawing was a tangle of shapes and colors that didn't obey any obvious rules. A yellow form floated above a blue scribble. Stick figures leaned at impossible angles. Nothing about it matched the clean geometry Harrison was used to. He accepted the paper as if it were something fragile. "Thank you," he said. Lyra beamed, satisfied, then skipped back to her seat as though she had completed an important task. Harrison stared at the drawing, unsure why his throat had tightened. No one had ever given him anything without asking for something in return. He had accepted awards, contracts, framed photos, all carefully negotiated. This wasn't a transaction. It was a gift in its purest form, offered without expectation, handed to him by a child who had no reason to trust him, and yet had done so anyway. Renata noticed the way he held the drawing, as though afraid it might vanish if he loosened his grip. She walked over quietly, stopping beside him without speaking. Lyra watched them both, eyes wide, waiting for judgment she didn't yet know how to doubt. "What do you think?" Renata asked. Harrison looked from the paper to Lyra's hopeful face. He searched for the right words, something thoughtful, something kind. Instead, a single syllable escaped him, unguarded and raw. "It's perfect." His voice caught on the last word, barely audible to anyone else in the room. He cleared his throat, but the moment had already landed. Lyra grinned, delighted, then returned to her crayons, mission accomplished. Renata didn't comment. She only studied him for a second longer than necessary. In his expression, she saw something she hadn't seen in years. Not pride, not calculation, but vulnerability. A man who didn't know what to do with a feeling that couldn't be measured or improved. Harrison folded the drawing carefully, placing it inside his jacket pocket like something worth keeping. Renata felt a subtle shift, the kind that doesn't announce itself but changes the direction of things all the same. Renata watched Harrison linger near the wall long after the art session ended, the folded paper still tucked close to him. He didn't rush to his phone. He didn't glance at his watch. He waited while Lyra gathered her crayons, waited while another child needed help tying a shoelace, waited while the room slowly emptied of noise. It unsettled her more than any grand apology could have. She had prepared herself for indifference, even awkward charm. What she hadn't prepared for was patience, the kind that doesn't seek reward, the kind that stays when there is nothing to gain. As they walked out together, Lyra skipping ahead toward the door, Renata found herself studying Harrison from the corner of her eye. His posture had softened. His attention followed the child, not the messages lighting up his screen. For years, she had been the one bending to fit into his life. Now she saw him bending toward hers. The realization didn't comfort her, it frightened her. Because change, no matter how welcome, always asks for trust, and trust had once cost her everything. Harrison didn't announce his return to their lives. He simply began appearing. Outside the youth center when Renata locked the doors for the evening, on the same bench at the park where Lyra insisted on feeding birds crumbs from her sandwich, in the back row of a small community event where parents clapped too loudly for children who were only brave enough to stand on a stage. He never asked for permission to be important. He never spoke about the past. If Renata thanked him for helping carry a box or holding Lyra's jacket while she tied a shoe, he accepted the gratitude without turning it into leverage. There were no grand gestures, just consistency. He learned which mornings Lara liked extra syrup on her pancakes and which afternoons she refused to nap no matter how tired she looked. When he offered to walk them home, it wasn't framed as a favor, only as something that felt natural. Renata noticed, of course. How could she not? But she said nothing, allowing his actions to speak in a space where words had once failed too loudly to be trusted. It started with small discoveries. Lyra disliked loud engines. She covered her ears when motorcycles passed and clung to Renata's leg until the noise faded. She refused to walk near the abandoned pier at the edge of town, insisting they take the longer route, even when the weather turned cold. Harrison noticed these things because he was paying attention, not out of obligation but curiosity. One afternoon, as they waited for a bus, Lyra pressed herself against Renata, eyes fixed on a dark cloud rolling in from the sea. "She doesn't like storms," Renata explained quietly. Harrison crouched to Lyra's height. "Do you want to tell me what bothers you?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Lyra hesitated, then whispered, "The loud sky makes me think something bad is coming." Harrison nodded, not brushing it off, not correcting her. He simply stayed there until the wind settled and the bus arrived, holding the moment steady until she felt safe enough to move again. Renata watched from above them, surprised at how gently he listened, and how naturally Lyra trusted him to understand. The storm arrived without ceremony, clouds thickening over the town by late afternoon until the air itself felt heavy. Renata had just finished stacking books on a low shelf when the first thunder rolled across the sky, rattling the windows. Lyra froze. Her crayon slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor as she pressed both palms over her ears. Another crash followed, closer this time, and her breath hitched into quick, uneven bursts. Harrison crossed the room before Renata could reach her, dropping to his knees so their eyes met. "Hey," he said softly, keeping his tone steady. "I'm here." The lights flickered. Lyra's shoulders shook, and she buried her face into his jacket without thinking. He wrapped his arms around her, not tight, not loose, just enough to let her feel the weight of someone staying put. "It's just noise," he whispered. "It can't touch you." Renata stood a few feet away, hands half raised, watching her daughter choose him in a moment that demanded comfort more than familiarity. When the thunder faded, Lyra didn't pull back right away. She stayed where she was, breathing slowly, trusting the calm he had created. Later that evening, after Lyra had fallen asleep on the couch with the book open across her chest, Renata walked Harrison to the door. The rain had slowed to a whisper outside, the street reflecting porch lights and broken lines. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. The question wasn't sharp. It wasn't angry. It was tired, the sound of someone who had learned the cost of misplaced hope. Harrison paused with his hand on the doorframe. For once, he didn't reach for a careful answer. He looked back into the living room where Lyra slept, her curls spread across a pillow, unaware of how much weight she now carried in his world. "I don't want to be the man who only shows up when it's convenient," he said, "and I don't want to pretend that this—" He gestured toward the quiet room. "That it doesn't matter." Renata studied him, searching for the cracks, the signs of retreat she had memorized years ago. All she found was uncertainty, and a sincerity she hadn't prepared herself to meet again. She nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in recognition. "Then don't disappear," she replied. Harrison didn't leave right away. He stood there, the door still closed behind him, as if stepping outside might undo whatever fragile honesty had just taken shape. "I thought control was strength," he said, barely louder than the rain. "I thought if I kept everything clean and organized, nothing could hurt me." Renata remained where she was, arms folded, not defensive, steady. "But I've spent the last 2 years winning at things that don't come home with me," he continued. "I built something impressive. I just didn't build anything that feels finished." His gaze drifted back toward Lyra, then returned to Renata. "When she held on to me tonight, I didn't feel important. I felt needed. And that's different." The word lingered between them. Renata let out a slow breath. She had heard beautiful explanations before. What she was hearing now was not beautiful. It was plain, unpolished, and fragile in a way Harrison had never allowed himself to be. "I can't promise anything," he added. "I only know I don't want to keep living like the things that matter are interruptions." She said nothing, but something in her posture softened, just enough to let the moment remain. "Before we take the next step in this journey, pause for a moment." Harrison didn't return with speeches. He returned with presence. He didn't demand forgiveness. He earned trust through small choices, through being there when fear arrived unannounced and comfort mattered more than pride. Now I want to ask you something deeply personal. Do you believe people can truly change, not with words, but with the way they show up day after day? Or do you think some wounds are too deep to reopen? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story may be the one someone else needs to read tonight. If this chapter stirred anything in you, please tap the like button so this story can reach others who might be wrestling with their own second chances. And if you're enjoying the journey so far, make sure you're subscribed to Mr. Williams' Storytime, because the choices ahead will reshape everything these characters thought they understood about love, fear, and what it truly means to stay. Lyra insisted Harrison be the one to read that night. Renata stood in the doorway holding a folded towel, ready to interrupt if things became awkward, but Lyra had already climbed into bed and patted the space beside her with firm authority. Harrison hesitated only long enough to remove his shoes before sitting on the edge of the mattress. The book was worn from use, its cover peeling at the corners. He opened it carefully, afraid to break something by handling it too roughly. The story was simple, a wandering bear searching for a place to belong, yet every sentence felt heavier than it should have. Lyra listened with solemn attention, her chin resting on her fists, interrupting only to ask what certain words meant. Harrison found himself slowing down, giving her time to absorb the tale rather than racing through it. He had never read for pleasure. This was unfamiliar territory, and somehow the most important meeting of his day. Renata watched from the hall, struck by the gentleness in his voice. This wasn't the tone he used with employees or investors. This was something quieter, unguarded, and it unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Halfway through the story, Lyra shifted closer, her small body angling toward Harrison as if drawn by gravity she didn't yet understand. He kept reading, though his focus drifted from the page to the soft weight settling against his side. By the time he reached the final paragraph, she had curled fully into his chest, her head resting just below his collarbone, breath slow and even. The book slipped from his fingers and landed quietly on the bed. He didn't move. The room felt suspended, as though sound itself had chosen to leave them alone. Harrison rested his hand on Lyra's back, unsure if he had the right, then leaving it there when she didn't stir. He had held many things in his life, contracts, accolades, power. None of them had ever trusted in the way this child did in sleep. Renata remained in the doorway, the towel forgotten in her hands. She had prepared herself for awkwardness, for distance. What she saw instead was stillness, connection without negotiation. For the first time since their reunion, she couldn't tell who needed the moment more, her daughter or the man holding her. Later, when Lyra was tucked in and the apartment had settled into its nightly quiet, Renata poured 2 cups of tea and handed one to Harrison. They sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, steam rising between them like a fragile barrier. "I don't know what to do with this," she said at last, eyes fixed on the rim of her cup. "With what?" he asked. "With the way tonight felt." She met his gaze, not angry but exposed. "You don't walk into someone's life like that and not leave an imprint. I've worked too hard to build something stable for her to pretend I don't notice what this could become." Harrison listened, hands folded, not interrupting. "I'm afraid to hope," Renata admitted, "because last time, hope was what convinced me to stay when I should have walked away sooner." She swallowed, the words heavy but necessary. "I won't let her learn that promises matter more than presence." The room felt quiet again, not uncomfortable, honest. Renata had not accused him. She had invited him into the truth she carried every day. Harrison wrapped both hands around his cup, not for warmth but to anchor himself. "I don't blame you," he said, voice low. "You trusted me once, and I treated that trust like something I could postpone." He glanced toward the hallway, where Lyra's bedroom light had been left on, a thin line of gold spilling across the floor. "I'm terrified," he admitted, "not of the work, not of the changes, of losing this before I've even earned the right to want it." Renata studied him carefully, searching for the old defenses. They weren't there. What stood in their place was restraint, a man holding himself back not out of control but out of care. "I used to believe I could replace anything I let go of," he continued. "Another deal, another goal, another version of my life. But tonight," he shook his head slightly, "tonight showed me how easily something real can slip past if you don't recognize it when it arrives." Renata didn't reach for him. She didn't need to. The honesty in the room was enough. They sat in shared quiet, not solving anything, just choosing not to run from it. The conference room had never been this silent. Harrison stood at the head of the long glass table, while faces he had known for years stared back at him in disbelief. Screens still displayed projections for the expansion deal, overseas offices, acquisition schedules, profit forecasts that had once been enough to keep him awake at night in anticipation. "I'm stepping back from the international rollout," he said again, slower this time, as if clarity required repetition. Effective immediately, a murmur passed through the room. Someone dropped a pen. Another executive leaned forward, eyes narrowing as though this were a test he had misunderstood. "You're aware of what you're postponing," the chairman said carefully. "Yes," Harrison replied. He felt it, the familiar pull toward control, toward the version of himself who thrived on urgency and expectation. But beneath it was something stronger now, steadier. "I'm also aware of what I've been missing." No one applauded. No one smiled. This wasn't the kind of decision that earned approval in a space built on ambition. Yet for the first time in his career, Harrison didn't feel the need to justify himself beyond what he had already said. The throne he had guarded so fiercely was beginning to feel optional. They argued for him to reconsider. They spoke of timing, of responsibility, of what his absence would signal to investors. Harrison listened without interruption, the way he always had, absorbing their concern while quietly stepping outside of it. "I'm not disappearing," he said when the room finally stilled. "I'm reordering." A woman near the end of the table shook her head. "This isn't like you." He met her gaze. That's the point. For years he had defined leadership as endurance, staying longer, pushing harder, sacrificing quietly so no one would question his dedication. Now he saw how little that definition had given back. He had become irreplaceable to a company and invisible everywhere else. When the meeting adjourned, he didn't linger. He gathered his folder and walked out past a wall of framed achievements that suddenly felt like artifacts from someone else's life. His assistant called after him with reminders he didn't answer. Outside, the day was bright and unscheduled. He took out his phone and typed a message to Renata, simple and unadorned. "Are you and Lyra home? I'd like to stop by." For once he didn't worry about what it would cost. Harrison didn't arrive with flowers or speeches. He arrived with a small paper bag folded tight at the top, as if whatever was inside needed protection from the world. Lyra opened the door before Renata could reach it, peering into the bag with unrestrained curiosity. When she pulled out the soft blue dolphin, her face lit up with instant devotion. "For me?" she asked. "For you," Harrison replied, the words simple, the meaning anything but. She hugged the toy to her chest and ran into the living room, already assigning it a name Renata couldn't quite catch. Harrison stood awkwardly in the doorway, suddenly unsure of where to put his hands, as though he had brought something sacred into a space he was still learning how to enter. Renata met his eyes. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said. "I wanted to." The dolphin lay on the couch beside Lyra a few minutes later, already part of the room. Not a gesture meant to impress, not a gift meant to negotiate, just a small promise wrapped in plush, something that would stay long after words lost their strength. The beach was quiet in the late afternoon, the kind of calm that settles in just before evening claims the sky. Renata sat on a blanket near the dunes, shoes set aside, watching Lyra trace circles in the sand with a stick she had found. The sea moved in slow breaths, steady and patient. Harrison arrived without ceremony, jacket draped over his arm, the cuffs of his shirt rolled up as if he had finally accepted that some places didn't require formality. He stopped a few feet away, giving Renata space, waiting to be invited rather than assuming a place. They listened to the water for a moment, letting the sound fill what words hadn't yet earned. Lyra looked up and waved the stick. "I'm making rooms," she announced, drawing lines that only she understood. Renata smiled, then met Harrison's eyes. The light painted his features in a softer way than any office ever had, revealing lines he hadn't bothered to hide. "This favorite time," Renata said quietly. "She thinks the sun is resting." Harrison nodded, absorbing the simplicity of it, feeling how easily moments like this could have passed him by forever. They walked closer to the water, careful not to disturb Lyra's sandrooms. The tide crept forward in thin ribbons, touching their feet before slipping back again. "I owe you the truth," Harrison said at last. Renata kept her eyes on the horizon, giving him room to continue. "I used to think the hardest part of life was getting to the top," he went on. "But I was wrong. The hardest part is admitting when you've built something that no longer fits who you are." He swallowed, then met her gaze. "When I said I wanted a child but not with you, I wasn't choosing the future. I was hiding from it. I was afraid of what loving you fully would require from me." Renata's breath caught, though she didn't interrupt. "I don't expect forgiveness on command," he added. "I only want to be honest about the man I was, and the one I'm trying to become." The sea murmured behind them, indifferent yet steady, as if reminding them that time keeps moving whether people are ready or not. Renata listened without shifting her stance, her gaze steady even as memories brushed against her chest like old bruises. She had practiced this moment in silence more times than she cared to admit. The speech he would give, the apology he might offer, the way she would protect herself by not believing any of it. Yet standing there with the wind off the water pressing gently against her back, she felt the effort of holding on to fear begin to tire her. "I built my life assuming I'd never hear that from you," she said quietly. "Not because I didn't want to, because I couldn't survive needing it." She turned to face him fully. "I'm not ready to promise anything. I don't know if I ever will be, but I don't want to keep living as if the worst thing that ever happened to me is still happening." Harrison nodded, not pushing. "I'll move slowly," she continued. "Not for you, for her, and for me." The words didn't close every wound, but they loosened something that had been clenched too long. Renata exhaled, allowing the moment to exist without armor. Lyra interrupted them before either could add another word, sprinting across the beach with laughter trailing behind her. Her hands were coated in sand, her shoes nowhere to be found, her hair caught in the breeze like she had been set loose from gravity itself. "Mommy, look!" she called, skidding to a stop between them. "My rooms are castles now." She lifted her arms, sending grains everywhere, oblivious to the way both adults leaned back to avoid being dusted. Harrison laughed before he could stop himself, the sound startling in its ease. Renata crouched to brush sand from Lyra's wrists. "Castles already?" she teased. "They needed towers," Lyra explained seriously. Harrison knelt beside them, not invited, not refused, just there. He watched the way Renata's fingers moved through Lyra's hair, the way Lyra leaned into the touch without hesitation, and felt something settle inside him. Not relief, not victory, but belonging. The sun hovered low over the water, turning the sand gold around their feet, as if sealing a promise that hadn't yet been spoken, but was already taking shape. 2 years later, Lyra filled every room she entered. At 5, she moved through the world with fearless energy, barefoot whenever possible, questions trailing behind her like confetti. Her laughter no longer surprised Renata the way it once had. It anchored her. The little girl who had once clutched crayons in cautious silence now spoke to strangers as if everyone were already a friend. Harrison watched her from the kitchen doorway as she danced in the living room, the stuffed dolphin tucked beneath her arm, now worn thin at the seams from constant affection. She narrated her own movements, turning ordinary moments into stories no one else could see. Renata caught his eye and smiled, a quiet acknowledgement of how far they had come, not together as a perfect family, but as people who had chosen presence over fear again and again. Lyra spun until she lost her balance and landed in a heap of laughter on the rug. Harrison stepped forward to help her up, and she waved him off, already on her feet. "I meant to do that," she declared, and for once he believed her. Saturday mornings belonged to pancakes, not the tidy kind arranged for photos, but the sort that stuck to the pan and collapsed when flipped too soon. Lyra stood on a stool at the counter, sleeves rolled past her elbows, flour dusted across her cheeks like she'd wandered through a cloud. Harrison handled the stove with exaggerated caution, while Renata cracked eggs into a bowl that already carried fingerprints. They bumped elbows, laughed at nothing, and pretended not to notice when batter landed on the floor. Lyra stirred with too much enthusiasm. "It needs more sugar," she announced. "It really doesn't," Renata replied, though she sprinkled some in anyway. By the time they sat down to eat, the table looked like a small disaster. Syrup pooled near the edges. One pancake was shaped like a heart, whether by accident or intention no one could say. Harrison raised his fork and paused, taking in the scene, Noise, mess, warmth. This was not a morning he could have scheduled or controlled. It was better than anything he had ever planned. The drawing hung in the hallway between the bedrooms, set inside a simple wooden frame Harrison had picked up from a shop down the street. It showed 3 figures holding hands beneath a wide yellow circle meant to be the sun. None of the faces looked quite right. The arms were too long. The heads leaned at odd angles. Lyra had given it to them months earlier, declaring it the whole house in one picture. Renata had laughed and taped it to the refrigerator at first, never imagining it would become permanent. Harrison was the one who insisted on the frame. Now he paused beside it each morning before leaving for work, straightening it even when it hadn't moved. It wasn't art by any traditional standard, but it carried more truth than any certificate on his office wall. Lyra stood beside him one afternoon, studying her creation. "That's me," she said, pointing at the smallest figure. "I know," he replied. She moved her finger to the tallest shape. "That's you, and that's your mom," he added. Lyra nodded, satisfied. The picture needed no corrections. It already showed everything that mattered. Harrison still worked long hours. The company hadn't disappeared, and neither had responsibility. But the weight of it no longer followed him through the door at night. Now, when he arrived home, Lyra met him with a running start, the dolphin often trailing behind by a fin. Renata called from the kitchen, asking about his day, not because she needed details, but because presence was now their shared habit. He sometimes thought about the man he used to be, the one who measured worth in stock values and approval ratings. That man had been rich in ways that never translated into warmth. This life was quieter, smaller on paper, yet every room held proof that something had been done right. A table scarred with use, shoes by the door that didn't match, crayon marks that never quite came off the walls. He no longer chased legacy, he lived it. And for the first time, wealth wasn't something he owned, it was something he felt. Before we close, take a moment to sit with what you've just experienced. Harrison spent years building a life that looked impressive from the outside, only to realize that the moments that truly mattered couldn't be earned or managed. They had to be chosen, day after day. Renata rebuilt herself from loss. Lyra became the quiet miracle neither of them planned. Now I want to hear from you. What part of this story stayed with you the most? Was it the courage to leave, the strength to start over, or the decision to stay when it finally mattered? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your words may help someone else recognize what they've been holding on to or what they're ready to let go. If this journey touched you, please tap the like button so more people can find it. And don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Williams' Storytime for more stories about love, resilience, and the choices that shape our lives. There was a time when Harrison Langford believed his name would be remembered for the size of his accomplishments. He imagined headlines, buildings etched with his initials, rooms that echoed with praise long after he left them. He had chased that vision with discipline and resolve, telling himself that anything worth having required sacrifice. He was right about one thing: it did require sacrifice. What he never considered was what he was giving up in the process. Renata learned that lesson from the opposite direction. When her life collapsed into a single sentence, she didn't rebuild by climbing higher. She rebuilt by planting herself somewhere quiet and allowing love to take a shape she had never planned. She learned that survival doesn't look heroic most days. It looks like getting up tired. It looks like finding joy in small hands reaching for you in the dark. And Lyra, she never cared about the world Harrison once ruled. She didn't know his titles or his accolades. She knew the sound of his laugh when her pancakes came out crooked. She knew the way he listened when thunder made her afraid. She knew the steady comfort of a story read slowly, even when the ending was already memorized. That is how life teaches without speeches. You don't discover what matters when you stand on a stage. You discover it when no one is watching, when the house is quiet, when the day has taken everything it plans to take and still asks for a little more. Some people spend their lives trying to leave a mark on the world. Others learn to leave a mark on the people who matter most. If there is anything to carry with you from Renata, from Harrison, from Lyra, it is this: the greatest thing you will ever build is not something you can point to or post about or defend with numbers. It is the choice to stay, to listen when it would be easier to leave, to return when pride tells you not to measure success not by how high you climb, but by who is waiting when you come home.